Now we will move to start to describe each bone separately. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now I will start to describe each bone of the upper limb separately. But as I mentioned in my lecture, for descriptive purposes, to describe each bone, I have affixed items that I must follow to describe each bone. First, I must mention to the site of the bone. Second, to the type of the bone. Third, general features. Fourth, particular features. Fifth is the site determination. And finally, what are the joints formed by the bone? I will start with to describe the clavicle. Clavicle, as a site, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, it forms the anterior part of the shoulder girdle or pectoral girdle. This is regarding the site. Second, regarding the type, clavicle is classified as I mentioned in the lecture, is classified as a long bone. Classified as long bone, but it is situated horizontally. It is a long bone situated horizontally. Third, about the general features for any long bone, I must describe ends, two ends, and the shaft in between. Because of the clavicle lies horizontally, so the clavicle has two ends, medial end and lateral end. How I can differentiate between the ends? The medial end is more or less circular or rectangular, while the lateral end is more or less flattened. So this is how I can differentiate between the medial end and the lateral end. The medial end of the clavicle is sometimes known as sternal end because of this end articulate, as I mentioned here, because of the medial end articulate here with the sternum to form this joint, which is known as sternoclavicular joint. While the lateral end is sometimes known as acromial end, as I will describe later on, inshallah, in this video. This process is known as acromion process, which is a part of the scapula. So because of the lateral end of the clavicle articulates with the acromion process, so here we have this joint, which is known as acromioclavicular joint. This is why the lateral end of the clavicle is known as acromial end. So again, clavicle has two ends, medial end and lateral end. Why? Because it anatomically lies horizontal. The medial end is circular or rectangular, while the lateral end is flattened. The acromial end is known as sternal end and form sternoclavicular joint, while the lateral end is known as acromial end and form acromioclavicular joint. Then what about the shaft? The shaft of the clavicle. The shaft of the clavicle is S-shaped. S-shaped, as this is the normal holding for the clavicle, like this. So the shaft of the clavicle is concavo-convex. Concavo-convex. I mean, the junction between the medial two-thirds and the lateral third of the clavicle, which is this junction, the shaft is convex anteriorly. And this part of the clavicle is the part which is palpable subcutaneous below the neck. And the lateral third of the clavicle, which is this part is concave anteriorly. This is why the shaft of the clavicle is concavo-convex. And the junction between the medial third and the lateral third of the clavicle, this junction of the surgical importance, because of this is the commonest site for the fracture of the clavicle. All surfaces of the clavicle are smooth except the inferior surface. All surfaces of the shaft of the clavicle are smooth except the inferior surface. And the inferior surface carries several landmarks which are of importance. These landmarks are arranged from medial to lateral. First, we have this impression which is known as costal impression. So costa means rib. Because of the inferior surface of the clavicle, as mentioned here in this model. So the inferior surface more or less in a contact with the first rib. So this is why the first rib form this impression on the inferior surface of the clavicle close to the medial end, which is known as costal impression. Then when we are proceeding laterally, we will be faced by a groove. This groove lies in the middle third of the inferior surface of the clavicle. This groove is known as groove for subclavius because of that we have a muscle attached to this part of the clavicle, which is known as, this muscle is known as subclavius muscle. And then proceeding laterally, we have this elevation in the form of a cone, which is known as conoid tubercle, because of that it is similar to a cone. And lateral to the conoid tubercle is this elevation, which is rectangular in shape. This elevation is known as trapezoid ridge. So the inferior surface of the clavicle carries 4 landmarks arranged from medial to lateral: costal impression, groove for subclavius, conoid tubercle, and the trapezoid ridge. So to proceed to the next item for the description of the long bone. So again, for a revision, what about the site? What about the type? I described the general features. Particular features will be postponed till the end of the course. Fourthly, what about the site determination? We have certain fixed rules to describe the site in anatomy. First, where is the anterior from the posterior? This is the first question. The second question, where is the medial from lateral? The third question, where is the superior and where is the inferior? To apply these 3 fixed rules in clavicle, where is the anterior from posterior? I can differentiate anterior from posterior by the change in the shape of the shaft of the clavicle. So the shaft of the clavicle, the medial 2/3 of the shaft must be convex anteriorly, while the lateral third concave anteriorly. This is how I can differentiate between anterior and posterior. To differentiate medial from lateral, by the shapes of the end, as I mentioned in the beginning. The medial end of the clavicle is circular, which is the clavicular end, while the lateral end of the clavicle is flattened, which is known as the acromial end. Third, how I can differentiate superior from inferior. As I mentioned, all the surfaces of the clavicle are smooth except the inferior surface that carries these 4 impressions. This means that this clavicle is right clavicle. So by application of these 3 fixed rules, I can decide that this clavicle is right clavicle. The 5th title or the 5th topic that you must cover during the description of any bone, what are the joints formed by the clavicle? Medially, the clavicle form the sternoclavicular joint, and laterally, the clavicle form acromioclavicular joint. Let me to apply this one in the skeleton. So this is here. This is the medial end of the clavicle that form this joint, which is the sternoclavicular joint. and the lateral, this is the acromioclavicular joint. These are the two bones formed by the cleft.